Yeah, we're just doing the live broadcast for you on YouTube.
Okay, but minimize and I will not close it, which is the Google
Yeah.
site. I will not touch it. Where do you want to be at?
Did she find
You're
it?
the most handsome among us, so you should be settled.
Is that her phone, Maria?
Is it in order of speaking?
Maria, did she ask the country?
Yes, I've also
Her name
been
is- Squeeze it.
How many are there? They don't?
Do we have to sit here and click or? I mean, I guess we're gonna speak here.
Hello, how are you doing? Are you okay? Yes. This kind of an urgent thing about this Spanish TV.
Yeah.
Actually, it's tomorrow. So, are you going to go to the mountains? You want to go? So, CIFOR is not available. I also want to go. Yeah.
Something every other day. That's life.
That's life. All right.
What?
Oh, you want to do it?
You have an interview.
Spanish language.
No.
TV interview tomorrow.
Sí.
Sí.
Por favor.
Yeah.
El deforestación es muy
No.
mal.
Yeah, no, we take it easy because the mountains. Because
Jeg skal det hvis du vil ikke.
I have to confirm. I'll say it again.
Ja, det er bra.
Because I already said, I mean, I made it clear that I'm not available, but maybe my colleague.
Vi går for begge deler.
Okay.
Det er bra. Vi gjør som Rosenborg.
Yeah, Spanish TV.
Too bad. Not a day.
It was a paper
Where's you were
here.
writing things on?
This one?
And it's not in the other room?
Because you have been
Make
taking
sure I didn't-
hand phones, maybe we
Yeah,
take
you're
something.
taking phones. Maybe you grab. No, that's what I have.
Is it this here?
No, it was for printed paper. That's okay. I can always stream it.
So we'll be able to see that there. Is that the idea?
Should we change the banner? Yeah, it looks like a pointer. You realize there's a big Pan-Africa climate justice banner next to us, right? I'm being ignored.
What is big? What did he say?
There's a banner over there on the stage that's not us. We should probably remove it. And where is our banner? Here they come. Cats coming.
Yeah, here's start. It's just
What is, how do I introduce you? Our Anschütze
Professor
of
Development Environmental Economics, Norwegian University of Life Sciences. I wonder if this is working. Why did it work? You start. Mine. See.
1 second. I'm opening all. So which is the format?
So maybe should we sit here in the 1%? Should we stand there or how do we do it?
Totally. You have this, that to see, but no notes.
You don't see it here because then you can see the
I
next
find
slide.
it annoying. Let me see the IT lines. But then you still have it here. And so you don't have to turn the screen.
Yeah. Video crew doesn't like that.
You have to be a bit careful with that one because there is a live stream going on of this whole session. There was a question. Maybe sit while we which one?
They said I'm not allowed to. They were like, it's right now.
When I came in, there was a banner there from another.
Yeah.
You know him? Yes, I forgot his full name. He's working with Juan Shang. That he's improving. Working with the Green Climate Fund. So he's a forester, so he's a lot. Forest, maybe, and he used to work with IBD before. So I was discussing that they have it's really making, you know. I had an hour discussion with him, an hour-long discussion with him this afternoon. They in a way wanted to read as we thought of it.
Yeah.
With result-based payments to the countries and yeah, which is I'm kind of thinking it would be nice to try out Red as we planned, as some planned, just to see because I'm curious to see if it will work.
Well, if there's funding, we certainly have a lot of experimentation. What might work without funding, pretty much. So.
next to Arrow. Or here, just
Silakan duduk.
right next to Arrow on this side. Because then
Is this your or Maria? Oh. I think the guys in the back controlling, so.
But where is the presentation? You want the presentation? Oh no, it is.
And we do with this. Maria, do you have some to tell me?
yeah. Martin,
Das ist nicht von dir, ne?
that is mine. So, der Platz ist frei.
Ich habe noch 2 Stück.
Toll.
Mein
They're so tight. I didn't expect it.
Ja, aber er hat natürlich recht.
Shall we? Good evening, everybody. And my name is Maria Brockhaus, former CIFORian and now University of Helsinki. I'm very, very happy to see all of you at this late hour in this remote place here in the last tent. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. And I can promise you that we will have a very exciting event because transparency, as we all know, is crucial and it's a core element in the whole Paris Agreement. So we will hear very different perspectives. The first 3 talks all are strongly scientific, but what we are doing here in this session and what we intend to do is basically to highlight a little bit the political dimension of numbers, data, of evidence, evidence-based policy making, or the desire for that. We will also hear something about, I think, policy-based evidence. So really kind of mapping out the different political dimensions of numbers, of information, and the need for transparency or strive for transparency within the Paris Agreement. And without much further ado, because time is flying and the faster we are talking, the more time we have then also to talk with the audience. The first talk will be with Arild Anchilson, and Professor Anchilson, as most of you will know, he is professor at UMB for development and environmental economics, and his talk will be about REDD+ reference levels. And the big question is, are they biased, these reference levels? So please, Arild, take the floor. Thank you.
Working, yes. So this will be a scientific presentation, and I'm doing what scientists are supposed to do, which is, if it was a classroom, I would have pointed at someone, asked them to tell, but they're supposed to test hypotheses. And I'm going to test 2 hypotheses. First time they are presented, by the way, so you chose well to be here. Numbers, there are 2 perspectives on that. One is, I'm just running through quickly some background. One is to see it as kind of this is rational science and planning. We want to generate knowledge and objective information about the real world, and we need numbers for that, for decisions, for planning. The other one is to see a number as part of a political game. A political game which is about self-interest, promoting that to get power, to get material gains, and so on. So numbers kind of are biased because there's not a single number. There are many numbers of there, and you can create them. So this is what Maria alluded to. This is the difference between evidence-based policy-based making or policy-based evidence making. We need both perspectives, and I'm going to run through maybe with a little bit of look at the latter. What are the potential bias for these reference levels for emissions? Well, any system is susceptible to manipulation and biases in the numbers, particularly in result-based. Why? Because results are the basis for payments. In red, you have that the emission reduction is defined as a reference level up here minus the actual reductions that you have down here. So it's a gap between the actual emissions, say, for a given period and the reference level for that period. It defines the payment, as I just said, but also more in general the reputation. If you're re-elected as a president, your bragging rights at the international conference, because my country, Panama, to take a country that has not submitted, Panama can say we reduced emissions a lot. It's particularly difficult in red because we started off with a very poor information base. We have maybe a lot of money, but some 10 billion. Diversity of interest, rules and practices are being written as the game is played. And reference level is even more difficult than a standard number because it's a hypothetical case. What will be the emissions in 2020 if there was no red? The counterfactual or the business as usual scenario. There's a lot of guidance from that, from the COP a few years ago in Copenhagen in 2009. The basic thing what this says, there are two things. Historical data, which is the average for a given period, this plus some adjustment for national circumstances. And the national circumstance is a little bit of a black box that some have said it's a can of worms. Every time we try to open it and discuss and be more concrete, the discussion is so big and there's so much disagreement that we quickly put the worms back into the can and close it. My kind of observation is that there has been a shift in how we are defining that from kind of a business as usual to assess performance, that it's also what some have called the FIB, a financial incentive benchmark or a crediting baseline, a baseline for payments. Another thing is that it's seen as a purely technical issue, although it's used as a basis for payments. And a third observation that there are many options. The rules and guidelines are not clear, as I said, so it's not a single recipe. So what I'm saying, I'm not saying that there is a correct way of doing it. There are different ways of doing it. So the systematic biases, or what I call gaming. Maybe I should say that gaming in economics and social science is a very neutral term. Game theory, for example, is just about strategic interaction. So there's nothing kind of bad about it. We play games every day, and we are all gamers in one way or another from that definition. The way I kind of try to define is kind of strategic or deliberate selection of numbers for own benefits. Not that you are selecting the wrong numbers, but on the menus, you select numbers that serve your own interests. That's what I call gaming. How? There are different ways of doing it. Historical reference period, adjustment for national circumstances. It can be how you're doing that. It can also be the activities, the scope, the things you include. Here are my research questions and the two hypotheses that I seek to test. The research question is this: do countries systematically select historical reference period and national adjustment that increases their forest reference emission levels? And the hypothesis that countries with declining rates of deforestation tend to choose early starting years for historical period. Now, the reason is that if you have kind of declining, if you go back a bit in time, you get some high deforestation years included in this historical basis, and therefore the reference level becomes higher. Now, the second hypothesis is that countries with declining rates of deforestation tend not to adjust for national circumstances, while countries with increasing rates tend to do so. So you find an argument, so maybe you should have adjusted downwards, but you don't, and if you have a chance to adjust upwards, you do. Let me say that I look at change in deforestation based on what is reported, And for example, the Hansen data and others may be different. But I think it is what the countries report that kind of forms the basis for whether they would involve in this. Here are the questions. They look at 15 submissions that are so far. All of them intend to use them for result-based payment. Just a few points on activities that are included. All of them have deforestation. About half has also degradation and carbon stock enhancement, and a few also mention conservation and sustainable management of forests. Mainly on national level, a couple, Brazil, just Amazon, and Colombia, not the whole country. And forest definition varies, just to note that. Hypothesis 1. Historical reference period is chosen, and how does that vary based on what they are? You can look here, just figure and just go back to the conclusions here. 6 out of 7 countries that did not select 2000, 2001 as the starting year has a benefit from doing so. I'm not saying that each and every country did so because they want, but there is a pattern here. If you did not choose it, which was the standard, you kind of had a benefit in terms of getting a higher reference level by not doing so. And it seems just one country that did not kind of benefit from choosing another one. There may also be other reasons, as I said. Among the 8 countries that report declining rates of deforestation over the period that they discuss in the submission, 5 chose an earlier starting year than 2001. So this is where what is reflected here. Those among the 6 that choose something before, 5 out of those had kind of decreasing deforestation, so that by including years before 2000, you got a higher reference level. I mean, one particular case to look at that has, of course, a dramatic reduction in deforestation is Brazil, as you can see here. And they are reporting different. What I think is interesting to compare with the Amazon fund and what was in this Antilla and others early proposal about RED was to have a 10-year rolling average. So you update every 5 years, so take last 10 years, updated every 5 years. This is the Amazon fund kind of formula. So from 2016, it will be the average from 2006 to 2015. Now, in the submission, the main is to kind of go back to 1996 and keep that kind of a 20-year and keep that 1996 as starting year, and then some call that dynamic average, but keep the starting years and just move forward and add the end year as time goes on. What difference does it make? Just for the sake of keeping my time here, the difference between the average of this period that is proposed, where it was 13,000 or close to 14,000 square kilometers, and 2006 to 2015 was about 8,000. Now, if you translate this into, for example, the agreement with Norway, that is supposed to be result-based, but that's another discussion. It translates into with 100 tons of carbon per hectare, and it should be a T here, and 5 tons of $5 per ton of CO2. The difference between these two reference levels in a result-based system that does not exist, maybe it will be in the future, we don't know, it roughly 1 billion per year, which is illustrating that how you set reference level and this difference between these two have enormous implications. But Brazil is really, I mean, the difference are not that dramatic for other. One, because Brazil is a big country, and 2, their deforestation rates has been declining so dramatically over the last few years. Adjustment for national circumstances. Is it also such that the countries that maybe had a declining rates, they may say that, okay, it seems to be going down here for various reasons, so we're on a good trend, so we could even, the historical is too high, maybe we should adjust downwards. The red ones are those with decreasing deforestation, and we see most of them do not adjust. What about those with increasing deforestation? Well, 2 of them do some upward adjustments that are justified. I don't mention a lot of countries who they are. These 2 are Peru and Guyana, and there are 2 that do not do that. So, about the 8 that had declining deforestation, none of them choose a downward adjustment, and 2 indeed chose an upward adjustment, and some of these upward adjustment can be well justified, as I come back to in the next slide. 4 that had increase in deforestation, 2 of them chose an upward adjustment, as I mentioned, Guyana and Peru. 1 announced that it will do so, that's Ethiopia, and 1 chose a more recent starting point at Zambia. And then you have Vietnam as kind of an odd case that made really a downward adjustment due to the policies that were implemented and said that historically it's made probably too high for our business as usual. Very kind of honest, and the response we kind of would like to see in a way. Example of the national circumstances for Colombia. As I said, plus 10%, the kind of the peace situation that may create a more conducive environment for businesses. Guyana, that used this combined approach with national and global deforestation. And Peru, who included the full regression equation in their submission and ended up with a reference level 20% higher. But you can see there is, they have good arguments for arguing that there is a trend. I always like this. I saw it first on a tweet, and I don't know who's the author of this. At the reference level is benchmark set so low that success is guaranteed. I think it's a nice way of coining it. This is not a kind of a naming and shaming game, and countries may have good reasons. But the pattern, when you look at all these submissions, and there will be more in January, they suggest kind of some systematic choices based on own interest. And I think to ignore that is kind of to make highly unrealistic assumptions about both human and political behavior. The problem, as I see it, is the UNFCCC rules. They say basically, please suggest from what point you would like to get paid. And there's not a strong review process, and what we need is this independent scrutiny that say, okay, what is the justification? What are the patterns that emerge? I think what's at stake is the effectiveness and additionality. Setting reference level too high is the same as saying that you have no additionality. And without that, it's also questioning the credibility of the system if it's going to be used into a performance-based payment system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnold. And we will move straight to Martin Herold, professor in Wageningen University.
I think the mic.
And actually he is professor. So our next speaker is Professor Martin Herold in Wageningen University, professor for remote sensing. And his research focuses mainly on forest and land use monitoring in the tropics. I'm surprised that I have to read it from this page because we know each other for many years, but just to play it safe. If you have burning questions, please write them down or just memorize them, because we will have time for discussion. We make sure that we will have time for discussion after all the talks and our discussions that will provide a country perspective. So Martin, the word is with you, please.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And of course, we tried to take a closer look at the whole transparency issue, because that is what's being discussed here. And actually was quite happy to see over the last couple of days how many events, small or big, have actually tried to address that problem. Because I guess we all kind of try to wrap our minds around what the kind of transparency issue can mean. And we have tried to contribute to that, and there's an info brief, and that's going to be basically the core of my presentation. Well, you can also, try to find it here. So this is basically the core of my talk. In the land use sector, and what came out of Paris, I think we have to rethink really, or think again on where we set our priorities for the monitoring. And that is because we have, Article 5 in the agreement, forest strong. We have the kind of need to address agriculture, not only as a driver of deforestation, but the other not supposed to harm food production. We have this big expectation that the land use sector is going to have all these things, but that's what the climate people tell us, to achieve 1.5, because the land use sector is the only one that actually has worked in the past, or so far. So we have that quite a set of important expectations to the land use sector. We have also this Paris Agreement with this bottom-up process, broad engagement. Everybody needs to work together to address the issues. We have to start working on the climate change. So this bottom-up process really creates this necessity for transparency. And so when you think about monitoring, it's not only about this regular stock taking and this kind of stuff. It's also about transparency, and it's particularly about stimulating and implementing activities. And this notion that we'll have to do better and share and better understand what's actually happening, what activities are being done and what's the impact of those. That also this idea of independent monitoring has started to arise again. It's not a new term. It's been around in FPIC and a couple of other ones, but it's now merged in the line of the Paris Agreement. So one of the first questions that we asked ourselves, what does it actually mean? And if we don't know an answer, basically you ask. And so we did a stakeholder survey where we asked across the board, and sorry for the complicated graph, if you want to, and that's the moment, if you can't read it, you might need to pick up one of these to actually have a close look at this. But basically says across the different stakeholder groups, they have quite different expectation of what independent monitoring means for them. And if you kind of summarize this diversity of responses and stuff like that you see in that graph that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, it is very clear that this independent monitoring idea is not a specific tool or specific system or one serves all approach. It's rather a way to embrace diversity with the purpose of increasing transparency and broadening the stakeholder participation and confidence. What we have found is that what makes monitoring independent and what are the key criteria, we have a number of 5 elements that seem to be reoccurring. Not all of them have to be basically met to be part of that, but that's the kind of things we saw. So transparency in data sources, definition and methodologies, free and open data and tools that are barrier-free to all stakeholders, that you have this issue on increased participation and accountability of stakeholders, that there is an issue with the complementarity to mandated reporting by the countries, and the promotion of the IPCC principles. That is basically what we are finding as kind of the key element. So from this very broad perspective, how can that actually now look in practice when we think about the Paris Agreement? So if you think about these 3 monitoring objectives that you kind of have, the first issue, the first challenge we have is about the national greenhouse gas reporting. And that, it's the greenhouse gas expert, and you think about RED Plus and also the capacity development that have been done as part of the readiness phase that have really targeted this part. And so in terms of transparency and some of the recommendations from our side on that, it should be seen as a great opportunity because it builds confidence and legitimacy. Transparency can actually cause initial frustrations because it might need to rethink some of the ways monitoring and assessment has been done, but in the longer term, it actually enhances quality. And so these processes should also be open for surprises that you actually find. If you change your data, if you invest in capacities, if you invest in accuracies, your data will change. And that is an expectation. And sometimes there's some stickiness in estimation. That would be the right moment to overcome that. Transparency requires capacity, and we know this varies on the various country levels. From RED Plus, we know about this kind of notion of stepwise, of flexibility, of different entry points, of different way of going about it. If you're looking for a common framework, I think that's quite important. And it's also important that transparency reduces ignorance. In fact, there is an encouragement to actually look at the advantages and the kind of diversity of these different approaches, the data set, and how they can actually be useful for countries to take that further. My second point is related to the technical assessment. Basically, if one thinks about what kind of technical assessment of reference levels, update reports, stock take, and all the things that are on the horizon, you wonder who is going to do all these assessments, so in terms of the experts. And from the monitoring side, the question is, how can one actually support these things? So, and we did a study, looked at these various AFOLU databases. So there's a couple of them. There's FAO stats, there's EDGAR, there's another independent study that has been done. There's large disagreements among them, in particular on the tropics. Perhaps that's not too surprising because these databases were never made to agree. They were done for different purposes. But if you'd like to think about how these kind of things can be useful, maybe to have a bit of a benchmark also for a review process, is we have to understand the disagreements, and they are there. And this is the kind of approaches that we as a monitoring community can actually help to do. So this better dialogue between the various people that producing data in the land use sector is quite important. Independent monitoring can actually be helpful in preparing some of the harmonized reference data for technical assessments. In the international expert community should be actually able to provide better guidance and training materials on actually how to use, for example, global data sets. We see quite a proliferation of those, but the complementarity, their uncertainties are often not understood, and that will determine a lot on how useful they actually are for that purpose. The IPCC good practice guidelines need updates. I think that is also recognized, and of course, open data and open source tools are quite helpful. My third point, and that's moving a bit away from this national level accounting, is more so how can we actually use better data to think about where and how to do mitigation actions and why. And that is a bit I want to show a study that we have been doing where you actually see the hotspots of AFALU emissions. So this is basically in red, you see the emission, and in blue, you see the sinks. This is various processes in the land use sector that have been basically added up here in a spatially explicit way. And so you can see basically this is the total amount. And here you see the sources, whether they come from the forest sector, or from livestock, or from crop. And if you think about landscape scale solutions, about, for example, mitigating forest emissions, mitigating agricultural emissions, or both, you can start to use some of these data sets to get a bit of a sense on what to do where. So in terms of these mitigation planning, there is more information needed, in particular on the landscape on the local level. And we think about the land use sector, we talk about REDD+, we talk about climate-smart agriculture, we talk about restoration. And in these kind of landscape settings, ideally they would all work together, and they don't at this point in time. So my last point, is basically then how we can actually support the implementation and the monitoring of the implementation. And there are a lot of things that are actually going on here. So for example, the whole issue of just plain sustainable supply chain monitoring, accountability of local activities of local stakeholders doing something. I'm showing here an example of bi-weekly time series data that are coming free and open from the European satellites that can help us to track activities basically globally on a very detailed scale. And this information can be used to basically assess and compare performance of different activities across space. In a project that we're doing for the German Climate Change Initiative, we are using these kind of tools to look at performance, comparing different villages, of control villages versus intervention villages, of how interventions compare to larger, to broader scale kind of assessment. So these kind of things can actually be done, and they can help a lot, not only about the national, but also the local level performance as part of a national system. And of course, if you then are able to integrate these approaches, these near real-time remote sensing approaches with information coming from the bottom up, some of these ground-based expert monitoring, which can be land managers, communities, forest rangers, and stuff like that, you can actually make use of this information and create an environment of open exchange of information. I think we start to have a solution where you can actually really try to increase participation and partnership to address some of these key challenges. So last slide. So this for the implementation side, it's not just the system. It's basically, and that's what I'm trying to show, is a variety of practices. So you should understand independent monitoring as a variety of practices. That a participatory, interactive environment actually creates a lot of open exchange and partnership. No data that is perfect, but local activities are real. And often what we are finding is if you talk about activities, you can actually get a broad engagement from the various partners. Actually trying to be complementary to national reporting from the local level, actually, and promoting the IPCC good practice guideline is an advantage. And as part of all of that, and that's my last point, is then, so we think about transparency, the independent monitoring, and the way this can actually help. So we might actually have here a very important tool that can actually lead and really support that some of the transformational changes that are needed can actually happen. And we have some of the data sets that CIFOR has produced over the years, pantropical. So a lot of the things I've shown here is all available on a new portal that we just put up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin, for these insights in that the technical is actually also the political, and it matters who counts and what is counted by whom. So that was really excellent. So the next speaker will be Anne Larsen, who of course will also talk about the politics of MRV, and she puts MRV in a context of multi-level governance, something that in all countries is a reality. And It's linking basically the local through the national with the global, and the many, many challenges that come with the different actors involved in these multiple levels and multiple interests. And Larsen is leading since years now the multi-level governance component of CIFOR's global comparative study, and works with a global team in multiple countries. Another complex effort. And please.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I can't get these quite in the right place. So I'm going to talk about multi-level governance Mrv systems. We're going to see some of the things that other people have already talked about a little bit here. Do I have the clicker? Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by multi-level governance? We're talking about, in our definition, who makes decisions and how decisions are made from the national, the global to the national, down to the subnational level. We're including formal and informal institutions, power relations that shape these institutions, and the practices on the ground, not just policy. Why do we want to research this when it comes to issues like land use and land use governance? We need to understand the relationships between actors at multiple levels, vertically as well as horizontally across sectors. We all know that forests are affected by many other sectors outside forestry. We want to look at how government, through its multiple levels and sectors, exercises key functions and sets policies and norms that shape incentives, but recognizing that government is only a part of the story. And we understand that formal and informal groups of actors or relationships between actors lead to decisions in practice on the ground, not only from government, but also from the private sector, NGOs, indigenous communities, other communities, and so on. So we come to these research questions from a scientific point of view. MRV requires transparency and unbiased data and analysis, but it's not only a scientific system. We've already heard this a little bit from other speakers. We've also heard about how this science can be manipulated by politics in quotes. But I want to argue that not all politics are bad. Politics is about the world we live in, and we need to figure out how to engage between these worlds of politics and science. So we, as Maria mentioned, I was coordinating a research effort looking at multi-level governance and multi-levels of land use change in 5 different countries. I'm going to draw on some specific research here that we only did in Peru and Mexico. So the multi-level research was done in Indonesia and Tanzania and Vietnam as well, but I'm only going to focus on a smaller research project that we did, basically asking, in this complex multidimensional political context, what can we learn from the process of establishing MRV systems? And these systems are, so these are based on open-ended interviews in Mexico and in Peru, specifically with central and subnational governments, as well as building on the research we had already done and literature and so on. So the basics of MRV, I don't think I need to tell the people in the room this, but I put the slide in just in case. Monitoring is about measurement of forest area and change, as well as carbon. Reporting is the information on emissions and removals. And verification is this process of independently checking the accuracy and reliability of the information. So the objective of the MRV strategy, as stated in the red strategy for Mexico, I think it's pretty well stated here. It covers a lot of the issues I've seen in other countries. The purpose of the MRV is to develop a robust and transparent national forest monitoring system for the monitoring, reporting, and verification of mitigation activities in the forest sector, and which will contribute to follow up on the effectiveness of mitigation policies, offer both transparency and accuracy to the broadest extent, and promote local and community participation. So the idea that this is multi-level is not coming from me. This is coming from the way these have been actually conceived and implemented in practice. So what do we need for MRV? And I'm only picking and choosing a couple things that are relevant to my talk here. One of the first things that were set up in both countries were the National Forest Monitoring System, both in Peru and Mexico. And in both cases, they have very much a role for subnational governments, at least on paper, and not always very clearly, but it's very much a part of the system. So these systems, in terms of the multi-level and horizontal interactions, they need to be horizontally integrated into existing and future national monitoring systems. The whole idea from the beginning was not to create a parallel system, or at least that became clear over time. And there needs to be vertical integration that defines the roles and responsibilities across levels and also meets the relevant needs of subnational levels, both the National Forest Monitoring System and the MRV system. There's broad agreement on these points. In both Peru and Mexico, money was invested early on into some capacity building at the subnational level. It was a bit different in the two countries based on current existing capacities before that. In Peru, Madre de Dios and San Martin were selected as the two regions where investments would start first in terms of developing reference levels and give the national government some time to catch up, as it were, which resulted in some problems later. In Mexico, a number of states received funding from the GCF fund, the Governor's Climate and Task Force Fund, and we looked at Chiapas and Yucatan in our study here. So I'm not going to talk so much about the process itself. You can look at that if you want to go look at the publications that will be coming out of this research. But what I do want to talk about is a bit about accountability, transparency, and some of the challenges of the processes, and what it tells us about how we should or should not necessarily approach problems that we come in with grand ideas. And I think, well, I hope this is clear. So first of all, what is the best scientific basis for maps and reference levels? We've already heard from the other presenters that there are differences in terms of the science. The scientists themselves don't always agree. Certainly in both of our cases, we found these differences among scientists, differences between agencies within the same state entity, differences between authorities at different levels, and issues around whether, I heard someone say from a central level that they didn't want to do any ground truthing because it would avoid having to work with the subnational governments. So the problem here is that the science is also, there are legitimate scientific differences around the data, but there's also competition between scientists, competition over the investment they'd already put into their work, things that we could call politics. So the scientists themselves, we scientists, I am a scientist too, are not free of politics ourselves. So then we move into the MRV system itself. Beyond the experts, let's look at some of the other challenges. So there are a lot of questions about MRV, and they're not specifically about the science, but they really are social and political questions as well. And some of the questions that we see people asking, the failure to clarify the roles and responsibilities among the different levels, different visions from different actors of what MRV is, what it should be for, whose interests it should serve, and scale issues where the national systems were not allowing for if good monitoring and understanding of dynamics and effectiveness at the local levels, which limited what the subnational governments were able to do. So these are legitimate questions that ought to be answered through a political process and dialogue between the political decision makers and the scientists or experts on MRV. So then I think we need to move to the subnational governments themselves, which of course we see as political entities. So these are the political speakers, in a sense, speaking about their role. What should the role be for these governments? Subnational actors argued that they should not be limited to collecting information or validating results. They should contribute to the design, improve reference levels, and monitoring through local data. The data and the monitoring system should contribute to local land use planning and decisions. And in the Mexican states, they were also interested in direct negotiations with external sources of finance, which is something they can do as states in Mexico. With community monitoring, I really don't have time to go into it, but a whole nother sector or idea or part of the system that received some early funding in Mexico, for example, and tied to the MRV system, but then it was just kind of dropped, and now everyone's wondering what's happening to that and how is that going to fit into the system. So just to put some quotes out, the kinds of things we heard, discussions on MRV are technically complex, never-ending, and unbearable. There needs to be training for MRV experts in how to communicate what it is in plain language. What is MRV for? Is it for counting carbon or understanding which activities work and which do not? Who's going to monitor? What will be monitored? Which is the scale? If monitoring needs to be done tree by tree, and how is it going to be reported? Regional actors talked about wanting a seat at the table, and again, in Mexico, it was a little clearer in terms of what they really wanted to be able to do at the table. In Peru, I would say, it was hard for them to even figure out what the questions that they should be asking. And my favorite quote that isn't quite as relevant, but there's not even a word in Maya for carbon. So I just kind of like that. But the point here is, to what extent, I mean, in a sense, we know we need to keep politics out of science. We need to keep the bias out of the science. But I should work more on this myself, but I don't, which is that we shouldn't use the word politics to always refer to something bad. We live in a political world. So I think that we need to actually be embracing the politics, embracing the, and beginning to understand how to work across science and policy, how to make these systems work for everyone and not just meeting a scientific need. And it's very clear in both of the cases in Mexico and Peru. So just as a conclusion, MRV is a technical issue. To me, it's kind of an example of some of the ideas that we came in with when we thought about RED as well. It's an example of a technical and expert solution. RED was supposed to be quick, cheap, and easy. It wasn't, because we always meet the wall of reality. And the wall of reality is the complex political world we live in. So we rightly don't want this bias to color our science. We know that blueprints don't work. We know that top-down doesn't work. But we live in a political, multi-level world. We cannot and should not try to avoid the political, but rather to work with it. And finally, a greater understanding of the needs and interests of different actors through improved communication, dialogue, and trust between national and regional governments, for example, and between scientists and policymakers could lead to a more useful and effective institutional architecture for MRV. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. And actually, your last slide leads us to our last speaker here at the table, and that is that part of MRV is also not only governmental or state actors, but of course, there's a huge role for non-state actors, and I'm talking in particular about civil society actors. So we started off this whole session with upwards accountability and transparency in this relationship between parties and the convention and the reporting needs. But of course, there's also a dimension that goes downwards, and that is that states have a certain responsibility, and not only states, but also actually private sector actors to their citizens to then also point out and demonstrate that the commitments and the promises that we hear, for example, in zero deforestation debates, are actually fulfilled. And our last speaker is Tegu. And Tegu has a very interesting history as a political campaigner. He is currently the executive director of a very young organization called Madani. He has formerly worked for Greenpeace and started off, and also for Friends of the Earth Indonesia. And he will talk about the fight for transparency in the context of an Indonesian legal space that does not necessarily mean you actually get access to the data you need. Please, the word is with you.
Good evening, everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The last statement from is very interesting, because in Indonesia, what I learned, the transparency issues are totally political issues, because if we can be transparent, I mean, in the government, civil society, private sector, we can change everything, and we believe that we can save our remaining forests as soon as possible. And first of all, I would say that according to the transparency commitment, the government of Indonesia have a very, very strong commitment on it. We can see that since 2008, Indonesian government have a law that guarantee the freedom of information. So means the Indonesian have a right to get the information, to get the data regarding the forest management, regarding the natural resources management, and everything. And also in 2012, along with 7 other countries, Indonesia has approved the declaration, that Open Government Partnership Declaration. Now the membership has reached 70 countries. But the problem is, the implementation of the commitment still challenging. The citizen of Indonesia should going to long process to get the data. For instance, since 5 years ago, every single NGOs who really needs the data regarding the forest management, regarding the concession data, they should going to the code. We call it Commission of Information. And at the end, even we get win on the process, there is no guarantee that the civil society can get this such of the data, because the government will going to be appealed and then going to the highest court. It is like civil society in Indonesia a bit confused according to the strong commitment under the law and in the national circumstances and also in the global level. And lesson learned from the freedom of information fight for freedom of information campaign in Indonesia. Actually, why transparency is very, very important for us, because we believe that transparency is essential key to improve the forest governance to protect our remaining forests. No transparency, it is difficult for us to develop or maintain trust among the stakeholders, because I believe that to save our remaining forests, NGO cannot working alone. We need to collaborate with the government. We need to ensure that government have strong regulation to protect our forests, and then also we need to ensure that the private sector really have a strong commitment, not only on the paper, but also regarding the implementation. Because of no transparency implemented well now, so the trust among the stakeholder is still not really, the trust among the stakeholder don't have a good position right now. And because of the trust have not developed well, and then communication and collaboration among the stakeholders is nothing. Now, we still dealing with a serious problem because of no transparency, and civil society in Indonesia have a big problem, have a barrier to do the independent monitoring. And the consequences, if we continue the monitoring without the official data from the government, means the consequences, it's easy for civil society going to the jail, because we have a law to saying that we cannot use the data if no official sources. That's why, since, for instance, Greenpeace have going to the court to get confirmation that all the data concession in the right format, I mean the SAFE file, is open for public. Now the case is ending in the first court, but against the government doesn't want to give the data, and then the process will continue. From learning from the freedom of information campaign in Indonesia, actually the transparency have a two dimension. First is in the process, and secondly is about the content. Why we emphasize that the process or transparency on the process is important? Because the transparency on the process is important to build the ownership. Now a lot of regulation, a lot of commitment by the private sector on the zero deforestation, but fail to be implemented on the ground, because civil society people have no ownership on the regulation. And if no ownership on the regulation, we fail to get the effective collaboration on action for saving our forests. And then at the end, all of the effort that we have, this is just like a project to project, but not really saving our forests. Yes, at the end of my speech, I would to say that the transparency is the key is the key issue to save our forests in Indonesia, and then we really need to we really want to show the government really committed on this issue to support the movement of civil society to save Indonesian remaining forests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teguh. And before we give the word to the audience and hear a little bit about your experiences, I would like to ask first two representatives here that agreed to comment and discuss a little bit all the different talks that we have just heard. Perhaps I start with Leticia from Brazil first. Maybe you would like to share a little bit your points. And I think one crucial issue here for sure is that collaboration and cooperation for transparency is one thing, but perhaps it doesn't come from alone, and there might be also, it doesn't come without conflict and also confrontation. And transparency is not without dangers for those that work on transparency. Perhaps that's also important. Leticia, can I ask you to speak from the and comment on all the different presentations?
I wasn't expecting to come up here, but should have done my hair or something. Okay. Okay, I can just stay here. I'm wasting time, so let's go. Let's get into it. So good evening, everyone. My name is Letícia Guimarães. I work at the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil. I've been doing that for the last 5 years. Currently, we have a national committee for REDD+. The presidency of the committee is with the Ministry of the Environment, who is also the focal point for REDD+, with the UNFCCC. So I was at first surprised to be invited here to talk on an event about transparency in the Paris framework. But then after I saw the presentations, I realized that we were talking a little bit about REDD, which from our perspective is a financial mechanism, not a transparency mechanism. So then I started to understand a little bit where things were going. And maybe, you know, a lot of the difficulties in understanding the lack of science behind it, or the technical component within, is the different understandings of what the mechanism is there to do. So the mechanism as it was created is a basis for providing incentives for developing countries that are capable of showing fully MRV results, so real results. You want to make sure that you're paying for something that actually happened. The way that the convention found to do that is to set a few parameters to give guidance to countries on how to do that. So you start with a reference level, which tells you what the history of your deforestation is, and then you show the data on your results. Now, the key component of both submissions, and I think it's a point that maybe was missed by some of the presenters before me, is that the principles that were laid out for these documents are the IPCC principles that were mentioned as important for the transparency framework. So independently from the date that you choose, and if it goes up or down, the data is available, and that's key. Never before in history, you had all this data from developing countries who are working really, really hard to put this historical data together. So all the scientists can go there and do their own graphs and check on their own, you know, and scrutinize and do whatever they want. So there is no need for an independent evaluation, because independent evaluations are already ongoing. So Brazil has had the data on deforestation online, available for all, since 2001. Greenpeace has already redone our data. Other members of the civil society have done the same. As far as we know, not much mistake has been found. The ones that were found were corrected. And as it was mentioned here, the key is having the complete data and having it transparent so the society can use and, you know, provide the feedback to the government on what to do. We shouldn't be so scared of reference levels and what do they mean and doing analysis on it, because they're just a, you know, they're just a point, a way to see, are we making progress? As Brazil, I think we are. I mean, it's clear that we reduced deforestation a lot. Are we having difficulties now? Maybe a little bit. I mean, we are reaching a different threshold. But the important thing is deforestation has reduced a lot. We have a reference level, and having a reference level is no guarantee for payments. So don't be afraid. Just because our numbers are out there, we don't have the right to receive the payments. So why not? Why not be a little bit of a political process? Why not bring the different stakeholders to discuss the data? So I'm going to go to some of the questions to the presenters before me. Do the same bias that you see in reference levels or other MRVs also happen in GHG inventories in all countries? How many countries do actually have historical data to put out there? Does the level of scrutiny reduces the number of countries that will voluntarily present their data? Isn't it better to have more data and then, in a stepwise way, increase the level of scrutiny rather than, you know, from the outset say, oh, this is not enough, so you have to do better? What is the connection between REDD+ and transparency? I still don't get it. And considering that the NDCs were developed by countries in their own contexts, can the same analysis be applied to those? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leticia. Thank you very much. And perhaps not. So I will try this one here now. Thanks very much, Leticia, for your provocative questions. But I'm sure there are some linkages between REDD+ and transparency. But before we move further to the audience, let me also ask Samuel from Ghana to enter stage and also provide his comments as a discussant. And perhaps this is quite interesting also because Samuel is a member of the Ghana party, but has a strong civil society background. And perhaps you introduce yourself also quickly. Thank you
very much. Good evening, everybody. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. So my name is Samuel Mauto. I'm with the Ghana Party, but I work with Civic Response. Civic Response is an environmental NGO in Ghana. We focus a lot on natural resource governance, specifically on forest in the last 10 years. I think this conversation is quite interesting, and maybe I can just pick up from where the last speaker spoke. Is there a link between REDD and governance or transparency? And in Ghana, I think it's very fundamental. We don't see REDD as a new intervention altogether. REDD is basically addressing those same drivers of deforestation. And the drivers of deforestation are mostly promoted by those governance challenges, like transparency. There is not enough information out there for local communities to determine independently what government is doing for them or what he says he's doing for them. So I think on that point, there's a very, very strong linkage between transparency and governance. Sorry, and REDD. But let's still speaking on the point of transparency. I think it's good for our governments to make all these commitments at the international level. But sometimes translating those transparency commitments to the local level is a big challenge. So in Ghana, we've made a lot of transparency commitments, but interpreting it into reality is a challenge. And one basic reason is that the bureaucrats don't really understand the full implications of those commitments, and therefore are not able to deliver on the commitments, transparency commitments. So that's something fundamental. When we're looking at building capacity, it's not only the national level in actors that we need to build their capacity, at the district level, at the subnational level, and even the bureaucrats, they also need to be able to take that information on. So sometimes the capacity builder we talk about needs to actually go beyond just the usual capacity to actually coaching, so that we can get some results from the capacity that we have built for them. Quickly moving on, there are also issues about, in Ghana, for instance, we have clear laws, or we don't have really clear laws about transparency. Our constitution has general provisions which make information available, but the reality is it doesn't really happen. We're going to have a new subsidiary legislation in forest, and at least after about 10 years of battle with government, with the forestry authority, they now come to the realization that it is important to make forest information available. Now, it's not just going to be made available to civil society, it's going to be made publicly available on a web portal, so that anybody who wants information about what is happening with forests, with everything, they can go and find that information. I think that is something which is also very, very important. One other, maybe just ending here because a lot of people will want to speak. One other point which also hampers all the politics and the science is the issues of political agendas of different political administrations. In Ghana, one of the big challenges that we face is that every election, after an election cycle, if there's a new government that comes in, his political agenda is different. His priorities are different. And will they really be able to commit or keep up with the commitments that the previous government has made? Those are some of the big challenges that will impact transparency and how governments deliver on them at the international level. Thank you.
Samuel, thank you very much for these insights from Ghana. And with this now, the floor is open. And I see one question over there, one question over there, and one question in the second row, blue shirt, please. And please also introduce yourself. Try to be brief, try to be polite to all the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nils Ranum. I work for the Rainforest Foundation in Norway. I will be very polite because I will say I enjoyed the presentations. I have a question for Ariel. Very interesting. And of course, as a Norwegian, it's scary if inflated baselines, unrealistic reference levels lead to Norwegian tax money, or even worse, oil money, going to southern countries for not reducing deforestation. It's of course worse if RED is linked to a carbon market, as this will create hot air. But my question is about, with the creation of the Sustainable Development Mechanism, the new market mechanism under the Paris Agreement, is there any kind of, in principle, difference or less risk that countries, through their NDCs, will report unrealistically low ambitions, as they will most likely, we don't know how this mechanism will look like, but most likely they will be able then to sell units that they don't meet, so that you can see a big fake hot air market out there.
Thank you. One is over there. Sorry for this chasing exercise. We will collect a couple of questions more. One was here, one in the second row.
Good evening, John Honteley. I work for the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and I have a question to the speaker from Indonesia. Sorry, I didn't write down your name. Next week, Indonesia will start with using FLEGT licenses for the export of timber to the European Union, and this is as a result of an agreement with the European Union about controlling forest management and trade. And I understand that a very important part of that is the role of NGOs to monitor what's going on. And I know there's been a big fight about that, but in the end, apparently it has been resolved. Otherwise, the EU would not allow the FLEGT licenses. I could imagine that that information is also very relevant to see more in general what's going on with the forest in Indonesia. So how does this help to get more transparency in Indonesia on the fate of forests?
Thank you for this. Next question, please. Second row.
Thank you. Thank you for presentations, all interesting. I have a question for Ariel for the first presentation, which was quite provocative here. And Well, two consideration and a questions. First, okay, you suggest that there could be a possible bias, and you suggest also, among other things, that technical review is a weak one, could be a weak one. First of all, as you know, the review is focused entirely on the technical part, and can be potentially, I think there are tools now in the right decision to have a robust technical assessment. Of course, what is out of the scope is the political dimension, which you highlighted, and could be the possible aspect that could be criticizable. The same analysis can be done for the NDC. If you analyze the NDC, of course, the reference year has been selected carefully to maximize the benefit of the country. Those developed countries which have already reduced for a number of reasons emissions have selected a historical period well in the past. A developing country which foresee to increase their emission are selected, possibly sometimes inflated BAU to show that they are doing something better. Now I come for my preferred quote from Jim Penman, that if we are here to discuss about RED, we have also to thank him. And the quote is I also told yesterday this quote is to roll down a snowball does not need to be perfectly round. So I see a lot of imperfections in the RED process and in the INDC process, but I tend to be slightly optimistic. I see the snowball starting to roll down. So since you know too well the RED process to stop at the provocation of the slides, which are very interesting. My question to you are, first of all, despite all the limits, do you see the snowball rolling down in RED? And secondly, how do you think the system can be improved?
Okay, thank you very much for a very long question. Let me go back to the panel here and start with Arnold and Tegu perhaps first. And if Martin N would like to say also something, please continue. But Arnold, the word is with you.
Yeah, there are good and difficult questions. I think one to start with the last from Julio is it's also a question I ask: how imperfect can a system be and still work? And that, I think, is there's no clear answer to that. But with this, as I would say, in some cases, it seems to be a pattern of some. Well, I should not do and kind of make judgment for each country, but the pattern that is emerging is kind of, yes, there may be some inflated baselines. Can it still work? And of course, if you have plenty of money and if you think that that is the mechanism, it will work, but you will have some non-additionality that it could be more effective if we didn't have that. But I still struggling with that, and I don't have an answer. But I think also I see it as a scientist and as a Norwegian taxpayer, not at least, to kind of say that here are some inefficiencies that we are to create, and we should not only look at the politics and see what's possible, but I think it's also space, and it should be for independent critical scientists to say, okay, this does not look good, and maybe point at some countries they are doing things strategically, as we all do. And I think it's human nature, it's political nature to do it. So it's not, that's the game. But still, this game may reduce efficiency. And then we have to find kind of this intersection between what is efficient and what is politically possible. Politics is not something bad. Politics is the art of the possible. I think it's also, you have exactly the same case with NDCs, and that would be an interesting case because many countries that make commitments, we want to reduce emissions by 10, 20% relative to a baseline. Maybe that baseline may not even be specified in that. And I'm, in general, a bit skeptical to this bottom-up approach, which sounds very nice, but I think this is a collective action problem. We need rules, and we need sanctions for those that don't comply with the rules. As a global community, we have to agree. That's the Kyoto recipe. That's the environmental economics textbook recipe, because the incentives each country and each of us are not sufficient to reach 2 degrees. And that's what we see. But that's the game in town, and the town was Paris last year, and now it's Marrakesh. To Nils Herman, I think if this becomes into a market mechanism, or maybe under GCF, if it's really being payment made behind, if they are used for payments, I don't think this is a prediction, my own. I don't think they will kind of accept it just right away, the reference level submitted. It's kind of a question, what are they going to be used for? It's useful for the countries to measure progress, as was mentioned here by Brazil. But if it's really to be as result-based payment, I think those who are going to pay the money would like to have a critical look, maybe be a matter of negotiations. If it's be even more in a market, I think also it has to have a scrutiny where you say that this is also a political. You cannot just make a political thing, just a technical thing, but say that this is political and there will be negotiations. That's my guess.
Okay. Perhaps.
Thank you. Regarding the data issue, actually, the basic problem of the data within the government, first, we don't have proper data. That's the real problem. Why the government doesn't want to give the data? Because first, the data itself, they don't have the data, because the bad management since a long time ago, and it is already like the common situation in Indonesia, where we give the licenses, we give the permits since long time ago without the clear reference. And now we also fail to documenting very well those data. And at the end, when we want to doing the monitoring, we need the data, and then we have no the data. That's the first thing. Secondly, the transparency of the data information is closely related with the corruption issues, because a lot of the corruption issues within the natural resource management is still big issues, and the fighting of the corruption is a bit slow or delay, because again, public doesn't have the data, and then cannot help the government to expose a lot of corruption or situation on the ground, to support the government to fighting the corruption. And how FPIC licenses can help the transparency in Indonesia? Actually, from the civil society side, we already using the freedom of information law to ensure we have a right, and then transparency is going well in Indonesia, but still fail, And I think another action need to be done is strengthen the market regulation, because we have to ensure that market really clear, to ensure that without the traceability, clear traceability, and without commitment from the government and then also the private, maybe Indonesia have a difficulty to go to the global market. I still believe that market have a power to somehow to change the situation. Of course, and also in that sense should be considered also the indigenous people right and the community right.
Yeah, thank you. But before I open the floor for the next round of questions, I don't think you have answered so far Leticia's questions to the panel. So I think it would be good to hear a little bit your opinions, if anyone wants to talk now, or we do it in the next round. Any volunteers here now? So perhaps you take a little bit more time to think that through. And I open the floor. Next question there. 2 and 3. Yeah.
I have found this presentation. My name is Don Brown. I'm from Widener University Law School. I found the presentation very, very interesting for reasons that would surprise you. We're doing another event tomorrow about transparency on ambition and equity. The transparency issues are the heart of whether Paris works or not. The question I have is, you can solve some of the transparency questions if you can be prescriptive in what the minimum information is that countries need to provide. There's an enormous amount of information that countries should provide on ambition and equity, which they're not providing at all. The question I have is, what is your hope that the negotiations will start to add? Where do you see the negotiations in putting content to the transparency questions?
Thank you. Next question here. I think we have 2 microphones, if you could hand over one, and the third.
Thank you very much. My name is Kairu from Kenya. And my question is not maybe directed to Aliel, who I like reading his work. Red really brought a lot of interest and expectations. I was expecting that under transparency to hear something about the commitments made. What has also been the transparency on payments of those who have committed. For instance, you mentioned 10 billion, that was what was committed by nationals, Norway, and the Nordic country. But nobody follows the commitment to produce the same. Meaning, therefore, that although there has been a lot of commitment, there has been less on the ground, either on the red preparedness processes, and I think the same will happen under the NDCs, where nationals are committing, they don't commit, So what is the transparency gap?
The transparency gap. That's, I think, a question for all of you. Another question over there.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Juan Chang from the Green Climate Fund. And taking into account that different countries are presenting different reference levels and different scenarios, is it possible to develop a mechanism that is one that fits for all? Should the mechanism for payments should be ad hoc by countries? Is it possible to standardize the approaches to turn those into payments? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Any other question at this moment? I would be ready to take one more, guys. It's late. You want to keep yourself active, engaged, asking questions. No, you don't want. Martin, please.
Yeah. So I think, and I think to the first question by the gentleman, so about the content of negotiation, I think when we have tried to separate it a bit, maybe that wasn't all that clear. I mean, there's this whole realm of discussions that are ongoing here, and I think a lot of people may be interested in what is going to be this enhancing transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, and that's very much related to countries, to country reporting. It's of course not only about mitigation, it's about other things that maybe also in terms of the support, so the financial, maybe about adaptation. So there's these broad things, and I think we made a couple points on that also from our side on how that is here. But at the end, it's very much a negotiation issue, I'd say, and I think we can go into some of the details of what we thought and what maybe be thought about in that process. But there's also the other dimension, which is more this transparency when you go to local realities and you try to actually engage, try to get buy-in, try to get accountability and all of these things, and actually implementing the kind of things we expect to be implemented to achieve certain outcomes in the land use sector in particular, where you by nature have a lot of people involved. It's not just a one-dimensional issue, right? And that is something where I think that will not be negotiated here. I think that's really something that the countries have to think about, or the implementing agents have to think about. And the point we're making is there are mechanisms, there are examples on how that can actually be done. And there is advantages of actually doing that, because the examples that we've seen have shown that if there is more transparency, it can ease the way of engagement, it can ease the way of getting buy-in from the various actors that you need. And a classical example is between the forest and the agricultural sector, which we know on all levels, on the negotiation level here, on the level of national agencies. Within our own university, Wageningen University is a classical agriculture university. The forest people barely talk to the agriculture people. So there's this big divide. And one of the ways you can break that open, actually look for opportunities and solutions, actually to start with some open data and some open ideas.
Anne, can I ask you perhaps to comment anything? Arnold?
Yeah, I think the gentleman from Kenya, sorry. Then I push, okay. The gentleman from Kenya, I think this kind of look at transparency of donors and expectations, which is, I take it as a comment and I agree, that is something on the donor side, how money are distributed, what are the expectations of what they kind of into the future, and be clear on that, so we shouldn't, they are also a part of this kind of transparency and discussion, and it may not be perfect there. Jose from had a question about related to the Green Climate Fund about what are the solutions. I think just one, you can make very clear rules. For example, you can say the historical reference period is from 2000 to 2010, which most countries seem to follow. They allow for flexibility, and there are arguments for flexibility, but they also give more options for selective choices, and that self-interest may pop up every now and then in that selection. That's one route. The other one would be to have some kind of independent committee kind of verifying and saying that these are also not just technical issues, but they have some. I guess a third would be that we are having today some open and critical discussion, and point out to that, and hopefully that have an impact. And on a good day, I do believe that. But in the end, I think it is a question of being negotiated, but I think the basis for that should be clear. Just maybe a final comment, since we are coming to an end maybe. I think transparency is to put the data on the table, and that's all very good. It should be done, and it's saddening to hear in Indonesia that having these laws that you cannot put data out there if it's not publicly approved, and you have had similar discussions in other countries. But you also have a problem in Indonesia, the one map that kind of we have heard in certain debates now, policy debates in other areas, that kind of everyone is entitled to their own facts. I have my data, and this is what the world looks like. You have your data. Well, I think it's a very high value, as Martin, that we agree on some facts on the world, and how that has hampered the development in Indonesia. So yes, we should have a debate, but we should also have it. Not all data have the same quality. Some are better than others, and we have a kind of common basis. And then my point about reference level is that, okay, we have the data, but data do not speak clear and loudly to us. We have to interpret them. I have a book in my shelves, How to Lie with Statistics, that I use every now and then when it's useful to me. No, I don't. But there is a lot of way you can present it, and there are a lot of biases that can creep in. So the data is there, it's just the first step, and then we need that kind of critical discussion about how they are used and interpreted, particularly when it is to predict about the future.
Thank you, Arnold.
I wanted to comment on the... Can I, Christian?
1 second, because I do have a question now to Arnold, and I'm using here my power as a moderator, but do you think this gaming, because so far we have discussed gaming in one direction, and that is the reference level settings by those countries, by the parties that submit, but do you think there's also the gaming on the other side? So by the parties that receive these reference levels, but then prolong the process and play with numbers by not accepting them. I think that was something I heard here in the room as well. So do you see gaming on both sides of the game?
It's yeah, it's perfectly possible, but I think, and I would be kind of my hypothesis that we all play a bit of games, and then I think, but it's also, I think the degrees vary. So I would also like to kind of someone to put out some hypothesis and try to see and test it, that if there is gaming, they are more likely to choose that. Do we see that pattern? Yes or no? So if someone would like to do that, that would be great.
Yes.
Yes, please come to the counter later.
Yes.
Martin.
And just very quickly on the point on kind of this one fits all kind of, should that be an objective? I mean, I mean, from a climate perspective, of course, it's important to get an idea of the collective effect of, you know, reducing deforestation across the whole global enhancement stocks and stuff like that. I mean, at the end, that's the positive effect you want. I guess formally the FAO, Forest Resource Assessment, these things, they have somewhat part of the mandate to do these kind of things. Do I believe that that reporting mechanism is ready to deliver that? I would say it can be improved to actually do that objective, right? So that would be my point. That would you want to set a global reference level? I would not know why you would do that. And just the fact that country circumstances are different, priorities are different, and all of that, there will be diversity. It's just that's just how it is. And the focus should be really on getting these circumstances right with the best possible, and try to get activities happening on the ground rather than trying to spend a lot of time creating a global reference level, which will never be agreed by anyone anyways.
And Tegu, if you don't have any final comments, actually we have exactly precisely 8 o'clock. We achieved a little bit the temperature goal here in the room, because in the final 10 minutes it became a bit fresher and cooler, but perhaps too late to move on. Leticia is still sweating. And I would say thank you very much again. It's late and it was great that you all came. I would like to thank also our donors. I would like to thank our partners that make this whole research and this work possible, and all of our friends that are here. And wonderful to see you outside. We will have a little reception there, if I'm not mistaken. And for those that are interested in some of our publications, please come to our booth, pick up the material, and enjoy your drinks and some food outside. Thank you.
Thanks.
Are you stay around tomorrow? You said that because I wanted to briefly talk about what's your schedule? You publish
Sorry for the easy problem.
No, but we got it in the last year.
And I have a few things I want to just go through 2 or 3 of the comments on the bookie report.
No, you did a great job, because all of a sudden
I might remind you, it's just a very little
feeling
clarification.
So, and especially if you sit here under the light.
Ah, yeah.
But great, it all worked out. I'm very happy.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll just turn off the live broadcast.
Good.